Hello, everyone. Chris here. And today we take a slight detour from our normal topic of digitization in the maritime space to discuss the impact of the Houthi attacks on the maritime shipping with our special guest, Michelle Wiese Bockman from Lloyd's List Intelligence. For those of you that listen to the podcast, Michelle came on back in the summer of last year where we talked about the dark fleet. Today, expect a deep dive into the challenges and adaptive strategies in the shipping industry, resonating with lessons from the COVID era. And if you enjoy this chat, don't forget to follow the podcast and leave a comment. Your thoughts and feedback help. Now on to the show. Welcome, everyone, and you're listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's podcast, we have Michelle Wiese Bockman, Principal Analyst, Lloyd's List Intelligence. This is Michelle's second appearance on the podcast. Last time we spoke about the shadow fleet, and this time we're going to talk about what's happening in the Red Sea. If you've been following this, you know that tracking not only what ships are going through the Red Sea, but which ones aren't and which ones are being targeted is pretty much in the news every single day. And Michelle is at the cutting edge of that news. So we are very happy to have her. Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me back.
Well, this is the second time around. I think we had you on about 6 months ago to talk about the Shadow Fleet, which was fantastic. My favorite podcast last year. And this year, I figured let's talk to Michelle because you write so eloquently and with so much knowledge about this topic. I love seeing your articles and what you have to say. So kick us right off. What's going on in the Red Sea and talk about like how you do your job on a day-to-day basis, given it keeps on moving.
Well, right now, I think I came back from the new year and we were in a day-by-day situation. There was an attack, ships were here. And then it's now hour by hour because I think at the time of this recording, we've had 3 military strikes against Houthi land-based targets. And each time there's been some retaliatory attacks on vessels, the rhetoric hasn't stopped. If anything, it's getting worse than ever. Ship owners have had to make some really hard decisions about whether or not to transit based on not only their risk appetite, but also charter parties, insurance costs, arbitrage trades. It's been a rapidly changing past 3 weeks. I have to say that.
Anybody that follows you and a couple of the other folks who are really, following this hour by hour can see that. Just to rewind a little bit, you kind of got your quote unquote start in looking at things that don't want to be found or make it hard to be found, looking at the Shadow Fleet. And for those that don't know, that's the fleet of tankers that have been moving oil on and still are moving oil on behalf of, let's say, Venezuela and Iran and now Russia. And that's become a whole, basically, for lack of a better term, shell game. How is there a lot of the similarities and differences compared to what you're doing then and what you're doing now? And are you still looking after the Shadow Fleet? Because that it almost is like, when something happens and then you forget about the other story, that's still a big story as well.
No. I never forget about the dark fleet. And actually, one of the most interesting things is while so many different trades have stopped using the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, there has been one constant, and that has been Russian oil going from the Baltic and Black Seas through the Suez Canal through to India and China. That flow is almost uninterrupted. Now, I use the word almost because actually today I wrote about there were 3 fuel oil cargoes that were loaded by Greek ship owners in the Baltic Sea. And when the US and UK military strikes were executed on January 12th, what we saw was a lot of the tanker traffic that had been until then going through, it paused at like deviation points to make the decision, do I go around the Cape? Do I go through the Suez? And so after about 3 or 4 days, we saw that those 3 Greek ship owners, they reversed course. Some of them sailed all the way down through the Mediterranean to the northern mouth of the Suez and sat there waiting to decide what to do. They've now reversed course and they're heading around the Cape, which is really the first time we've seen that particular traffic flow change. And of course, that will have consequences for the competitiveness of Russian oil because it's already deeply discounted. But now you've got additional routing costs, and there's some talk that with chartering, there are now options to take the Aframax cargoes from the Baltic, load them onto VLCCs and ship-to-ship transfers and sail it around. So the dark fleet's never out of my sort of analytical expertise. Of course, there's no more than tankers going through. There's bulk shipping. There used to be container ships, but we're not seeing terribly much of that, just geopolitically linked container shipping, feeder vessels. And interestingly, anything from China or Russia is not only advertising that fact via their automatic identification system, but seeming to think different risk appetite to think that it's safer for them. So you're seeing trade being split into anything with commercial ties to Europe, the US, the UK, and they're now avoiding anything that judges like the non-Western shipping interests are more likely to use the Suez Canal. So, you know, geopolitics and shipping intersects yet again.
It is quite unbelievable if you think about where we were now, or where we are now, and where we were. I'm going to rewind, 4 years ago, right on the cusp of really everything shutting down with COVID. I think about this time 4 years ago, we were getting a lot of the headwinds of that. And it is quite amazing about the interruption and disruption into global shipping. It's global shipping for 99% of the world is an afterthought. For the enthusiastic 1%, I think you and I are included. It's our bread and butter, our day to day. Explore a little bit more about your day to day. I mean, is there as much kind of shadow to what is going on now in the Red Sea as there is with the dark fleet, or is it a little bit less? Is it a little bit more transparent and things like that as you start to put together stories and things of that nature?
Well, one of the interesting things is that, the dark fleet's called the dark fleet because they turn off their vessel transponders, so you don't know where they are, which is known as going dark. But what we're also seeing in the Red Sea is we're seeing a lot of ships going dark. However, they're going dark legally because under SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea conventions, they're allowed to switch off their AIS if they're perceived to be in danger and for security reasons. And so what we're seeing is those vessels that are making the transit, they're making it at night through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, and they're doing it with their AIS off so they can't be tracked, and also with the cooperation and close contact with a lot of the naval assets that you see in the region. So obviously the UK and the US are quite a prominent force, but you've also got French warships that are navigating and escorting through CMA CGM, which is the world's third largest container line and French owned. And so they're providing that service to CMA CGM. I think the Indian Navy's there, the Danes and the Greeks are on their way. And there seems to be a legitimate area of going for dark, as well as, an absence of some of your traditional shipping using the Suez Canal, such as liquefied gas carrier, natural gas carriers. They've completely got out of that area. And also those really large container ships, the size of the Ever Given with 20,000 boxes on board, they're usually going from Asia to Europe, northbound through the Suez. Most of that traffic has gone. They were the first to deviate and reroute around the Cape. And now, of course, the tankers and the bulk carriers are the last people standing, so to speak. But now we're seeing that split, as I mentioned earlier, down geopolitical divides. So really interesting. And the only thing that I'd like to add to that is every single ship that goes through has like 20, 25 people on board, and they're just driving into a war zone. I mean, you have to feel for the seafarers that have to do these transits through no fault of their own, and cannot be a very pleasant experience at all.
I was talking about that very topic this past weekend with a friend of mine, and we normally go for a run. He has a foot issue, so we went for a walk with this giant dog. And we were talking about what's going on and, kind of the whole situation. And I said, for the seafarers going back to 4 years ago between COVID and the whole well-documented issues around seafarers not being able to get off and have to go past their contracts and all those sort of things that have been, well written about. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where a lot of people don't realize you would have both nationalities on a ship, and that has caused a lot of
Yeah.
problems. I would assume, whether you have to split the folks or people leave to go fight
Mm.
for their country one way or another. There was a lot of that there. And now we have this issue where you're putting people through a war zone. And I've seen things written about how will they be compensated? Where will those funds be, how would they be related at some point to the seafarers in terms of, a hazard pay? So certainly it's something that has, truly impacted the mariners and, again, most 99+% of the public, they don't look at that.
Nope. And you know what? If these were aeroplanes with passengers on board flying over a war zone where there was a risk of being hit by a drone, you wouldn't get pilots that would be prepared to make that flight. Um, People really do forget about seafarers and the jobs they do. It really annoys me that in all the media coverage that's been going on, very little attention has been given to the seafarers. And if I can just divert about the media coverage, oh my God, Chris, you would have thought the Suez Canal was closed off to the entire world in the first weeks of absolutely febrile reporting about it. That's what annoyed me the most. And I was looking at, vessel tracking that we have at Lloyd's This Intelligence, a sea searcher platform. And I'm looking at my sea searcher going, it's not closed. There's hundreds of ships going through. But you had the impression that it was like the Ever Given all over again. That's
Yeah.
really annoyed me.
Well,
Yeah.
it's really funny. And I think I've told this story before, so I apologize to my regular listeners. But I remember probably about a decade ago, maybe plus. It was plus because I was still shipbroking. There was an article in a California newspaper, like the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm not picking on any newspaper, but I just remember it that it says tanker hits Golden Gate Bridge, right? Okay. All right.
Fair enough.
It was a giant container ship that brushed. Yeah, it
Oh,
did hit the bridge. It hit the abutment. I think it may have lost steering and the tugs. It just frankly, like, that happens. But it was a giant container ship. But there was a spill because of the bunker tank. I mean, it
right.
was literally, again, 10, 12, 15 years ago. So they're not as, humongous as they are today. But it was a ship with containers on it, not an oil tanker. And
Oh,
I look at stuff like that and I go, come on, you could call me up and say, yo, Chris, what kind of, or call Michelle up and say, yo, Chris, Michelle, what kind of ship is this? Oh, that's a tanker. And it's funny, a funny anecdote I get from a friend of mine that has a beach house up in Rhode Island. She'll send me a picture, like when she's on the beach, of like, there's a Roro dock in Dansville that actually a classmate of mine, a couple years younger, he's the superintendent. She's like, oh, is this another one of these container ships? I go, or not container ship, Roros. I go, yep, it looks like a floating shoebox. That's what that
yeah.
is. So it's
Yeah.
kind of
They're the
funny.
easiest to spot. Yeah.
The easiest one to spot. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you bring up is you bring up about the traffic and the amount of traffic and the reduction of traffic. And we're going to dip our toes a little bit, maybe not into politics, but certainly in a way, in a path forward. And that is a resolution for all of this. And the one thing that has been kind of underreported, I think, is the material impact to Egypt. They're losing a lot of capacity, a lot of earnings. Let's talk a little bit about that because, in your tracking, you have to be looking at that as well.
Yeah. We're seeing traffic down in the Red Sea area by about 38%. That's just looking at vessel by numbers. So translating that through to the Suez Canal, that's got to really hurt them. I looked and got some figures. Canal Authority earned 9.6 billion in revenue for the financial year, I think ending June 30 in 2023, 700 or 800 million a month, roughly. That a couple of 100 million just on the back of the envelope.
Right.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we're in us, and this is the second month. So there has to be a resolution from where Egypt is. But then, everyone knows that the Houthis are backed by Iran, and the Houthis have really borrowed the Iranian playbook
Mhm.
because let's not forget, amongst all the chaos in shipping over the last 4 or 5 years, we had the Iranians, they always will seize or hijack tankers in response to the actions of the US government. Whenever the US government seizes a tanker, takes its oil because it's Iranian and sells it off, there will be another tanker hijacked in retaliation for that. And you've seen that with the hijack of the Galaxy Leader, the car carrier that was taken at the end of November. Most people have seen those YouTube videos of the Houthis wearing GoPros. And they're very sophisticated operation. And all of that is exactly how the Iranians operate, which is to disrupt and deter maritime traffic and commercial trade, but just enough to give everyone the jitters, not enough to shut things down. And that's what we're seeing here. I don't know where it will end because, today we're talking, there was a massive US and UK joint interdiction overnight, 80 such targets to try and find where all of these drones and ballistic missiles are coming from. While that equipment is very different from the AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades of the Somali pirates, it's also easy to be transported around the place. So I don't think that attacking the Houthis on land is going to properly stop them. Is it possible to have a solution with all of the craziness that's going on in the world? It's just almost too much for shipping to really even be able to absorb, I think.
You've said that 100% correctly. And I think it's going to be one of these things that it's going to take a balance of risk as well as, changing the supply chain to adopt for this. I think it goes to show what Lois Zabrocki once said at, I think, a CMA luncheon or dinner. She said, shipping is a very practical group. And I think what will happen is we will be very practical in this and figure out a way to kind of avoid it or work around it until it gets resolved.
Yeah.
And I think what that'll mean is, unlike COVID, and I was thinking about this a lot the last couple of days, where COVID was a lot of unknown unknowns, right? So if I think I'm thinking about it correctly, like we didn't know when it was going to end, how far, what here we still don't know where it's ending. That's the unknown, but we have a lot of control over some of the other knowns. All the supply chains are still working. So I was talking to my son about this actually, and this is what made me think about it is I said, this is going to be an interruption, but what will happen is supply chains will start to work themselves out where they will anticipate a longer voyage around the Cape. It's the first month or two that'll be crazy because you can't plan for it. And, maybe we learned the lesson from changing from just-in-time supply to just-in-case supply. So there's a little bit more of a leeway there. We also saw how supply points changed during COVID, especially around China, where companies diversified from China only to maybe into Vietnam, Malaysia, other countries to kind of change that. And I could see something similar happening again, not overnight, but 6 months from now, some of the supply chains may look very different. Costs will still be higher, I think, but it may not be as high as just not making any adjustments. And I that's kind of what I see happening, because I view it from a very practical point of view.
Yeah, and I think we have to remember that when the entire world shut down for the pandemic, the only thing that continued was global trade and shipping. That,
right.
It really, the seafarers were the heroes of the pandemics that nobody really properly recognized. And what created all that market chaos wasn't so much the delays and the diversions. It was the port congestion.
Right.
And that was related to COVID. So we're not going to see port congestion at the levels that we saw before. In terms of shipping costs, the only thing that I'm always reminded of, especially by tanker executives, when the market is tight, sometimes, and you've got really high utilization, sometimes it only takes the smallest thing to really spike rates because of the high utilization. And we will see, as vessels go longer distances and capacity is soaked up, especially in areas like container shipping where there is extra capacity, we will see there will probably be some pressures reflected there. But in terms of the headlines, global inflation, oil price rises, all of that, I think, has shown that the supply and demand fundamentals are such that we're not going to have the huge economic shock of a pandemic. With the caveat, of course, that we're talking in mid-January and who knows what's around the corner because the world is so crazy at the moment. So I would just say for shipping, I think we're going to have to check utilization because that will show us whether or not we're at risk of some sort of freight shock coming down the pipe.
Do expect, just from the tanker point of view, because of going back to COVID, because of the lack of new buildings that we saw from the tanker space, it was all containers all the time. And because of that, from my background, the generic kind of looking at things, I would say that, we're in a very light order book. I know recently it's kind of picked up for tankers, but you're talking 25, 26 before those are delivered. So really this year, probably, a decent amount, but not great. Last year was almost nothing. The year before was almost nothing. So you do have the tankers probably could benefit the most, as well as a little bit to some extent dry bulk. But I do think there's a resilience. And once, like you said, because of the ports, and the fact that there's not a lot of there shouldn't be a lot of congestion. We're not dealing with this. It's kind of geography wise, it is isolated. It's a huge choke point, but I think, like anything else, like those squeeze balls you have on your desk for stress, you squeeze one place, something else comes out. And I think that's kind of how we're going to look at this. As we wrap up, any parting thoughts?
Oh, not really, just that, I've been working a lot of hours and keeping an eye on this situation. I have a feeling that anybody involved in the Red Sea over the coming weeks is going to we're not going to have any short working days, that's for sure.
Absolutely. We can hope that this comes to some sort of resolution, but I think it's going to be kind of as you saw with Maersk container company, talking about like, oh, this is just a small interruption, and oh, this may be a little longer than that. And I think that's kind of just the reality there.
Definitely.
Well, Michelle, we look forward to reading all of your insights and articles because they are top class. I do appreciate you sharing your thoughts on LinkedIn, another place. It's some of the favorite things I like to look at. Michelle, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Chris.